Hello. All right, so today I'm going to be talking to you about fat cells and specifically how you can change your fat cells to improve your metabolism and your insulin sensitivity. So yes, you do actually have some control over how your fat cells behave, which is great news. Okay, so the two main types of fat cells are your white fat cells and your brown fat cells. So your white fat cells, you can see here, are full of fat. So this big blue circle is a fat globule. So your white fat cells basically just hold on to fat like a storage cell. So they don't do a lot in terms of, they're not very metabolically active in terms of burning glucose or fat. They just sit and hold on to the fat. So you don't see very many mitochondria in your white fat cells. So the mitochondria is this powerhouse of the cells. So basically in the mitochondria, this is where glucose and fat is burnt and turned into energy. So the cell can function and that way you're actually using up the glucose and the fat, using up the energy. And this is really important for insulin sensitivity because if your cells have lots of mitochondria, then your cells are going to take up the glucose, they're going to be able to utilize the glucose, and we're not going to run into too many problems. So white fat cells are really just like a storage cell and they don't burn much glucose or much fat. Whereas the brown fat cell is more like a muscle cell. So your muscle cells are really metabolically active in that they burn a lot of glucose and also fat. So they are full of mitochondria. They contain a lot of mitochondria. And these brown fat cells resemble the muscle cells a little bit more in that they too have a lot more of these mitochondria. So they are going to be like glucose sinks. They're going to suck the glucose up and they're going to burn it. So these brown fat cells are going to be creating a lot of energy and creating a lot of heat. So you may also notice that there's less fat in the brown fat cells, and that is because there's more mitochondria, so it's able to use up some of that energy. So there is actually some ways, more than one, multiple ways to make these white fat cells more like these brown fat cells so that they are burning more energy, they're burning more fat, they're burning more glucose, and they're sucking more of that glucose up out of the blood so that your blood sugars don't stay too high or they come down. So when we are basically making these white fat cells more like brown fat cells, there's a name for it. And it's called beijing. So beijing is turning your white fat cell into more like a brown fat cell. So how do we do this? One way exercise. Exercise is a brilliant way for turning these white fat cells into more like these brown fat cells. So when you exercise, you increase your energy demand, and the act of exercising is able to switch these genes on to promote this effect, this beijing effect, so that you are burning more calories just at rest, and you are increasing the improving your insulin sensitivity. Second one is cold exposure. So when you're exposed to the cold, your body will again switch these genes on to promote white fat cells, turning into more of these brown fat cells. And that is important because if it's cold, your body needs to try and stay warm. So by having more of these brown fat cells, the mitochondria are burning energy to create heat, and that heat keeps you warm and insulated. So you may notice in summertime that your appetite drops and you don't feel as hungry. And that is largely to do with the fact that you're not exposed to this cold temperature anymore. So your white fat cells are not being promoted into these brown fat cells, or pushed over and converted into these more like these brown fat cells. And now we live in such a climatized world where, you know, everything is comfortable. So you're only outside for a certain amount of time, you're all rugged up, and you're inside and the heating's on. And we don't experience these temperature variations very much. And to be honest, it's actually quite bad for our health, and it's really bad for our metabolism for this reason, because we don't ever get exposed to these cold temperatures, and our body isn't able to adapt. And in terms of, you know, this beijing effect happening, it's a lot less likely to occur. Interestingly, rates of diabetes are also less in cold climates or in areas where it is much colder. So clearly this is an important thing for metabolism and for insulin sensitivity. So in one study, they actually exposed participants to cold temperatures. And this is really not super cold. I mean, you don't want to be cold, so cold that you're shivering and becoming hypothermic. That's not really the goal. But in this study, they're exposed to about 14, 15 degrees Celsius, which is only, you know, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, thereabouts. So this was for 10 days. So on the first day, they were exposed to these temperatures for 2 hours. The second day, they were exposed to these temperatures for about 4 hours. And then day 3 to day 10, they were exposed to these temperatures for about 6 hours. So really, it's kind of like working outside on, you know, maybe a winter day, at least in Australia, not so much in other parts of the world where winter can get very cold. But it's not that cold, but it's cold enough. It was cold enough in this study, at least, to have a significant improvement on insulin sensitivity. So these participants, after just 10 days of this exposure to the cold, they had a 60% increase in glucose uptake. So basically the transport molecules that take the glucose into the cells increased by 60%, and insulin sensitivity improved by 43%. So that is really quite significant. And the improvement in insulin sensitivity is pretty similar to exercising, so long-term regular exercising. And we know that exercise is one of the most potent insulin sensitizing strategies out there. So cold exposure is really an under-recognized way of improving metabolism and insulin sensitivity. So when you pair the exercise with the cold exposure, you get an even greater effect. So for example, if you do an exercise session, whatever that is, maybe you do some weights or some resistance training, or, you know, whatever it is. If you do that and then you jump in a cold shower, or you jump in a cold pool, or you jump in the ocean where it's quite cold, this is actually a shock to the system. It's a good shock because it's a short, temporary shock, you know, as long as you're not out there for so long that you're, again, like I said, becoming hypothermic and you're shivering. But it's a shock to the system. It's a really positive shock, and it switches these genes on, and it drives these white fat cells to become more like these brown fat cells, because it's a shock. The body's thinking, God, it's really cold. It was really hot a second ago, now it's really cold. And it switches on to promote this beijing effect. It makes the cells soak up that glucose, so it improves your insulin sensitivity, like I said, and it even switches on longevity genes, so it promotes longevity. So if you're not brave enough to jump into a cold pool or cold shower after your workout, then at least be mindful that you're not constantly just trying to adjust the temperature so that you're always comfortable and you're always at the same temperature. Just be mindful that being cold is actually okay. So if you're going out for a walk in the morning, a brisk walk, you don't need to put 10 layers on. It's okay to feel a bit cold for the initial part of your walk. And you know, inside in your house, you don't always need to have the heater on. It's okay to be a little bit cold, and you know that's going to save you a lot of money as well. So that's the cold exposure. Then the third one is intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting works similarly to the cold exposure and exercise in its effect. So I'm not talking about just skipping breakfast. It's not the same thing. That's more time restricted feeding, which is different, and I'll do another video on the specifics of that. But intermittent fasting is where you're really going for extended periods of time with no food. So usually it's about 24 hours or more. So when you do this, your body is sensing that there's less energy available, and your body, it switches on genes that promote this beijing effect. The other thing that it does is that it has a positive effect on your gut microbiome. So these are basically the community of microorganisms that live in your gut, and we can manipulate these microorganisms to have effects on our health. And in the case of intermittent fasting, it actually promotes a type or a group of these microorganisms that produce metabolites. So they basically produce molecules that also stimulate this beijing effect. So when you are fasting, you're resetting your gut and promoting the growth of these beneficial microbes that also will promote this beijing effect. So the intermittent fasting one is another way, and again, you know, if you're putting all of these together, including all of these in your lifestyle, and it's all about shocking the system. So it's not about chronically being cold and chronically exercising, chronically starving yourself. It's the intermittent nature of it and the variations that shock your body enough to basically stimulate this effect. And in the case of fat cells, this beijing effect. Okay, and lucky last. So food. There are actually some types of food, or at least molecules in food, that it has been shown to promote this beijing effect. So that includes capsaicin, which is in chilies, for example. Resveratrol, which is in mulberries, grapes, peanuts, and I mean, you can get supplements of resveratrol, and resveratrol is being studied now as a sort of longevity molecule, but it's very early days. So I mean, I'm a little bit more conservative with supplements, because they do come with risks as well, and in a lot of cases we don't have a lot of good strong evidence, particularly taking them over a longer period of time. But resveratrol, then we've got curcumin, which is in turmeric. Sorry, it's getting messy now. Green tea. Menthol, which is in like peppermint tea and mint, for example, and omega-3s, And omega-3s you can get from fish sources, but you can also get them from algae. So basically you can get an algae supplement, or from sea vegetables or walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds and hemp seeds. So these foods have been the most studied. Oops. And have been shown to promote this beijing effect. So this is all a classic example of epigenetics. So epigenetics is basically when things in our environment can turn genes on or off to produce either a favourable effect or a not so favourable effect. So we can actually manipulate things in our environment to promote these beneficial health effects. So in this case, you know, exposure to cold, exercise, times or periods of fasting, and different types of foods in your diet can all have a really beneficial effect in switching these genes on to promote this beijing effect, which is ultimately going to improve your metabolism, improve your health, and improve your insulin sensitivity. I really hope you found that interesting and helpful. If you did, please make sure that you click on the like button below and share it with your friends and family if you think that they would also find it interesting or helpful. The other thing I just want to let you know about is my online program. So I do have a 12-week online program that teaches you all about what is at the root cause of this insulin dysfunction and type 2 diabetes. And I give you basically everything I know, everything that's available, everything that's out there that we know can help to improve this insulin sensitivity and treat it at the root cause. So I teach you so you become the expert, and so you're able to overcome this insulin dysfunction and type 2 diabetes for good. So if you are interested, make sure you scroll down and click on the link below to find out more about the program. You know, if you're really serious about this and you want to do everything possible to increase your chances of success, then this really is for you. Okay, so that's all. Thank you.